Gladys became Edgar Cayce's personal secretary in 1923 when she was 18 years old. And she continued as his secretary until 1945 when he died. And just last year, we celebrated Gladys's 60th year in the work. And for those of you who were there on that occasion, you know that probably no one in the country could draw such an audience as this lady did on that occasion, literally from all over the world. So Gladys probably has the distinction and perhaps the opportunity, or to have had the privilege, of knowing Edgar Cayce for a longer period of time and more intimately in terms of his work than anyone else. So she is well qualified to share with us the answers and some comments to some of those questions that we all have about Edgar Cayce. So let me get started, Gladys, by just asking, how did you meet Edgar Cayce? How did you happen to come in contact with him? And then secondly, what were your first impressions of the man?
Well, I met him, I think, around 1922. It was about a year before I went to work for him. My sister was in Hugh Lynn Cayce's class at school, grade school, and they were good friends. And I met Hugh Lynn before I met Mr. Cayce, and my sister had. He would come home with her. I remember seeing him walk her home with, swinging her books, in the afternoon, and. My sister had started to Sunday school at the First Christian Church, where the Cayces attended, and she was in with Hugh Lynn and a lot of other young people. They were in Mr. Cayce's Christian Endeavor group, Young Christian Endeavor, Junior Christian Endeavorers, and they went on to a convention of the Christian Endeavor Society in Birmingham, and Mr. and Ms. Cayce took this group, and my sister was among them, and I went to the train, walked her to the train, which was about 3 blocks from our house, with my father, and met Mr. and Ms. Cayce then. And I had met Mr. L.B. Cayce before that up at the studio, had my picture made, and I had, when a friend of mine, a girlfriend of mine, had mentioned Mr. Cayce giving readings, I thought she was talking about Mr. L.B. Cayce.
L.B. was his father.
Yes, and I didn't know that he was the one until 1923, a year later. And an older woman who worked where I did had borrowed me. I was a stenographer at Tissue Hardware Company, a wholesale and retail store. It was sort of like our Rose's department stores here. It had everything in it. This one had a little corner grocery out there. You could buy all kinds of things there, and you could buy your lunch if you wanted to, and then it had a dry goods department, and then I was in an office in the middle of this building, and I did the stenographic work for about 3 men who were. And I was in the office of the office manager, who was the accountant for the organization, and they sold plows and all kinds of farm machinery, and had salesmen going out. And Miss Willie Graham, this lady, was in charge of the Chinaware department, and she had borrowed me from the office 2 or 3 times to go with her to a hotel room where a salesman was demonstrating Chinaware, and had me take down the story of the Chinaware pattern and type it up so she could make copies of it and give it to had me make copies of it that she could give to her customers. And I remember this particular time, it was the story of the blue willow whale. And so I was, and she was, we all loved her. She was a sort of a mother type to all of the young people who were working in the store, and we'd go on picnics, you know, on our days off, our afternoons off. This was in the summer. It was in August 1923, and all the stores in Selma would close on Thursday afternoon through the summer. And
for an afternoon off.
Yeah, afternoon off, and we'd go on a picnic and out to Lake Lanier somewhere. And so I was planning to do that, but Miss Graham asked me if I would go with her to take down a reading she was having for her little afflicted nephew, who was in Birmingham with her brother and his wife. And so I hesitated, but finally I decided I'd do it. And so I went with her, and then when we got to the head of the steps of the studio, which was on the second floor, right off the Broad Street there, it was catty-cornered across from Tisha Hardware. It was just had to walk across the street. And he met us at the top of the steps, and he had a mirror there that he could see people coming from, you know, up in the, so he met us at the top of the stairs and took us in this little room, which was back of his dark room, and there were other people sitting there in the room, and he had a little cot that he sat on first and talked to us, and then lay down and started with the reading. And he was in his shirt sleeves, so he didn't have, the books all say he had loosened his collar and tie and all, but he didn't have one on that day. And he talked to us a while, and then he put his hands back of his head like this, you know, and lay there a few minutes just looking at the ceiling. And then he moved his hands down across his solar plexus this way, and I found out later, I mean, this was the procedure through the years, when his eyes began to flutter, you know, sort of like that, Mr. L.B., who conducted the reading, his father, would start to talk to him and give him the suggestion. And he would start breathing like this. His chest would go up and down like this, you know, sort of. Didn't make a noise like I did, but he would you know, his chest would rise like that, and then in a few minutes he would say, and Mr. L.B. gave him the suggestion for this boy and his address, where he was and everything, and he said, yes, we have the body, and started on the reading. And I was so busy taking it down, I didn't just hearing him. It was just like taking any other. I wasn't. So I remember once at a meeting in Florida with Nell Claremont. We were talking before a big study group there. I guess a combination of study groups that came to Tampa, I believe it was. And somebody asked me, weren't you awed by this, you know, the first time you saw it? And I said, no. I mean, it seemed perfectly natural. I didn't think it was odd or unusual. And Nell said, well, why should she be? Doesn't every boss man dictate to his stenographer lying on the couch asleep?
Or on his lap or somewhere like that, too.
Oh, me. So I was asked afterwards to, I found out years later, I didn't know it until there was a book that came out saying I applied for this job, you know, that I answered an ad for the job, and I said to Hewlett, how in the world did they get that idea? I mean, you know, I didn't apply for it. And he said, didn't you? You know, I mean, he thought, and he didn't even know. So
there were others in the room.
Others in the room,
competing
and
for the
I
job.
found out later that they were there. They were trying out for the job, and Mr. Cayce used to say, you know, that I've made the best copy of anybody, and reading. And it wasn't until I felt real good about that. And years later, I thought, well, my goodness, how did he know? He didn't even hear the reading. He couldn't tell whether it was better or not, you know.
He didn't hear the original.
No.
Yeah.
So then I was asked to make, Miss Graham told me that I was to make 2 copies of it, and see, this was a Thursday afternoon, and I mean late, and after work, and so I came on back to work Friday morning, and a girlfriend down the street who she was so interested in this, she wanted to come herself, you know, but I didn't have any. I couldn't ask her to come, you know. So, but she helped me transcribe some of the, helped me, I read my notes to her, and she helped me with the spelling of some of the words I'd never heard of, like dorsals and cervicals and something other, and it mentioned some kind of machine, iconoclast or something like that. Anyway, I can give you the case number of that reading if you want to see it, the first one I took down. And so she was very excited about it. And I went back to work Friday morning and typed off the reading, made 2 copies. And I must not have been very busy that morning. But often I had, when I didn't have anything else to do, I wrote personal letters. I wrote a lot of personal letters at work. So I did that, I guess, without anybody knowing it. They didn't pay any attention to me. I mean, when I was typing, I guess. I had so many bosses, I didn't know. Anyway, at lunchtime, she took the copies up to Mr. Cayce. I mean, 1 copy up to him. And when she came back from lunch, she came in and said, Mr. Cayce told me to ask you to think about coming to work for him, and if you're interested, come up and see him. And she says, I think you should do it. And so I never had a doubt. I knew I wanted to do it. I was bored, you know. I think the year before that I was just restless, and I felt like something was. I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what, you know. And
so Gladys, you took the job.
I did.
And that was the beginning of this long relationship.
Right.
What was your impression of Edgar Cayce, the person, not in trance, when you first met him?
I liked him. I liked him immediately. I felt comfortable with him. I think it was because I had never really had an adult man especially talk to me, well, like I was an equal, really. I mean, you know, instead of talking down to me, I mean, he seemed real actually interested in me as a person, you know. Found out he was that way with everybody, so it wasn't anything unusual for him. But I knew I wanted to do it, and one of the things he said to me when I told him I would, he says, well, remember, Miss Gladys, I think that was the day I went to work, the first day I went to work. He said, I went back and gave notice, a 2 weeks notice, and so it was 2 weeks later that I went to work for him on September 10th, 1923. And he said to me, one of the first things, now, Miss Gladys, he always called me Miss Gladys, not just Gladys, Miss Gladys. Remember, you'll be working with me, not for me.
Yeah.
That was the way it was.
Gladys, Edgar Cayce, when he gave a reading, didn't remember what he said.
No, no.
Was he immediately interested in it right after? That is, you would type
No,
it up.
he didn't.
Was he eager to read it? And,
He
and know about
didn't. He didn't show any interest in reading it. It was only after we began to get the life readings in Dayton, which was that same year in the fall, in November, that he would get Mrs. Cayce to read aloud the reading and discuss it. But he hardly ever read one himself. Sometimes people, later years, some people would want him to go over their reading with them, and they would come in and talk to him and ask him about certain things, you know.
So he gave a lot of readings that he actually never did
Oh
read or
yes,
review.
oh yes, he never did. He would just listen to what people told him about them.
Well, those who listened to the readings must have been quite astounded at some of the material that came through.
Yes, yes.
What was your impression? I know this was not only just initially, but over the years. What is and was your impression of the source of the information? Where did it come from?
Well, I didn't know. I think I didn't worry about it. I just accepted it. So many things I didn't understand. I guess I didn't know this was so unusual, you know. I mean, I'd never seen anything like it, but a lot of things I hadn't seen before. And as it, I mean, through the years, we were inspired by the readings. I mean, all of us close in the family there. And we'd listen to a reading and it would just give us courage and new hope and everything. Well, Mr. Cayce didn't have that, you see. He didn't hear the readings. But he would only know what we told him. He'd ask, did you get a good reading or whatever? And then if something exciting was in it, we'd tell him about it. I mean, something that he...
So he wasn't benefiting personally as well as those,
no,
as much as
no.
those around him.
We would constantly, and through the work readings especially, we'd get a reading on the work and it would encourage us. And the study group readings when they started, they were just full of encouragement and, you know, just helping you to understand yourself and be a better person and do what you were supposed to do in this incarnation.
His own relationship to the source of his information was sort of generalized, wasn't it? That is, he didn't consider himself a medium, for example.
No,
he wasn't.
No.
He didn't have spirit guides.
No, no, he didn't.
He had direct contact with some source.
Yes, and he believed that that it was a God-given, or he wouldn't have stayed with it. I mean, he lived on the what people told him, you know, how they'd been helped, and that made it worthwhile.
Now he really felt as a young person sort of like a freak, didn't he? I think he even used that term.
Yes, he did. He said when he was growing up, a young man in his teens, and he was called a freak, and you know, and he began to feel like one because he was different, and it wasn't until years later that when people began to get help from the readings and you know, give credence to them, that he began to get help from just hearing them tell how they had been helped by a reading. And also, when the first life reading came out, I mean, the first mention of reincarnation, I think that intrigued him, and maybe it sparked a recognition in him of the fact of reincarnation. I don't know, but he did
finally become comfortable
with
what he was doing.
He did, and he began to see it in the Bible too. I mean, there were many references in the Bible that you could interpret that way, and And then we began to get life readings that mentioned Bible characters, you know, that people who had been Bible characters. So it was.
Gladys, why don't we pursue that just a moment about the introduction of the reincarnation? That must have been very dramatic, and
yes,
it was in Dayton, Ohio.
in Dayton, Ohio. Well, when I had been with Mr. Cayce about, well, it was less than a month. I mean, it was about 3 weeks maybe, when Arthur Lammers came to Selma. He was a man from Dayton who had been interested with a lot of other people in the oil well business, and he, I think, had been trying to make money in oil wells to save his business, which was the Dayton Photo Products Company, and
it was Lammers' reading in which this was first mentioned.
Yes, yes, and Ms. Cayce, he took Ms. Cayce back to Dayton with him, and so he asked Ms. Cayce to read to me the old readings they had. They had copies of only about 600 readings that were in a cardboard box, alphabetical box by name, filed under that.
Now, there were many readings given before that were
yes,
not
there's no
recorded,
copies. I mean,
no
in
copies.
the old days in Kentucky, see, he gave the first one on himself in 1901, I believe it was, when he got his voice back, or 1902 or something like that.
And it was 22 years later, actually, when you began to write
Yes,
them.
right. And they were, he would borrow a stenographer from the bank there in Selma, who would come over after hours, you know, after the bank closed. You know. She'd come over and take the readings, and a lot of people, different ones, took them down.
Now, were you there when in Ohio when the first, the Lammers reading was given?
No. Mr. Cayce left with Mr. Lammers, and Mrs. Cayce was asked to give me experience with the readings, to read these old copies to me and let me take them down, just to keep me busy, I guess. And so I did that, and then after that we talked, and it was wonderful. She told me all about the family, her family and his, and how they've been sweethearts, you know, since they were in the teens and so on. And it was fascinating. And I used to love to read love stories, you know, all through my teens, and scared to death of boys, but I like love stories. Anyway.
Well, now Gladys has told me before that that she was terribly afraid of boys, that it was something karmic about it, but it was one she overcame early in life.
Right. Well, that was it was when I had my life reading that it mentioned that a fear of knives and a distrust of the opposite sex. But I'm getting ahead of the story about Arthur Lammers. Miss Cayce would get a letter from Mr. Cayce, and then she'd tell me what he said and everything. And one day she came to me and said, "Edgar wants us to move to Dayton," and said to ask you, you want to come with us? And I certainly did. I mean, no doubt in my mind. And so we went to Dayton, and when we got there, they had already gotten readings. One of them was Arthur Lammers, which mentioned, he asked Mr. Cayce, he was interested in astrology, and he asked Mr. Cayce if he would give him an astrology reading. Well, it was in this reading that mentioned certain characteristics of him, you know, and then it made this statement, like a side remark. He said, "You see, he was a monk once."
He was a monk?
A monk once.
Monk, uh-huh.
And so we, excuse me, they were getting readings. No, I don't know what's the matter with my throat. I took a little slipper elm thing. That ought to help that.
So it was mentioned that he was a monk, implying that this was in a
yes,
former life.
and so then they had other readings to find out who they were. You know, I mean, Edgar Cayce had a reading. I mean, it had a reading on the group. Arthur Lammers and Lyndon Sawyer and George Clingan Smith, who was a young man there from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. There were 4 or 5 of them, that main group, and these readings were taken down by Mrs. Rosenberg, who was, her husband was interested. They were, and some of them by Mr. Lammer's wife, I think, and typed up. We have some of those copies. But in this reading about the group, it said that they had been associated in the Trojan period, I believe, for destructive purposes, and should work together constructively this time.
Destructive of other people or other...
Well, they, instead of gaining in soul development, they lost in that period. And so that's what, and they had started getting readings on, it's in that group under 3744 series, all these questions asked about astrology and about dreams, and it was in that answer to that question, it said not enough attention is paid to dreams. You know, it would be better for everybody to, study the dreams and so on. So this is what we went into, and
what was Edgar Cayce's reaction
well,
to this?
I think he was fascinated, really, but he wasn't sure that it was, wasn't sure that it was right. He just questioned it. But still, when we got there, he was telling us about this, and so he began getting readings for the members of his family. He got one for Gertrude and one for little Edgar Evans, who was 5 years old, and he got one for Hugh Lynn, who was in Selma, had stayed in Selma to finish out the school year, and Hugh Lynn, I heard him on the lecture platform tell about how horrified he was when he came to Dayton, and he was given the life reading for his Christmas present. He read all these things, and he...
And he didn't know this was going on.
No, and he said to Mr. Cayce, he says, well, Dad, that's not what you taught us in Sunday school. Then he gave me a life reading, offered to give me one. It was very unusual for him to offer to give anybody a reading, but I saw it happen several times. When he felt he'd like to see a reading on somebody. And
could we focus, Gladys, for a moment on your life reading?
Yes,
and tell us something about what it contained.
Yes, it was. It said some wonderful things in it that have certainly come true. One of them was, one who with others will draw many of the more beautiful things of the earth plane about them. Well, that has certainly been true. It's happened, and all of you are part of it. Everybody in the work. I mean, it's just a wonderful thing. And when people asked me about how I reacted to I didn't. It was just all new to me, and I was given the 8th life reading, the 8th one that he had given, and the only thing that I knew was true was that he said that that I had a distrust of the opposite sex from the French incarnation. I think that was what it was from, and that had a fear of knives and cutting instruments from the Persian period when I had. It said, for in that manner the bodily destruction came. Well, later in other readings we gave a reading on him and all the rest of us who had been associated in that period. It said that that I was wounded by the sword and lingered, suffering. And so I knew those two things were true because I would never have a date with a boy by myself, and I'd go with a girlfriend, have a double date, get her date to bring somebody, And that went on for quite a bit. Never was very satisfactory. I didn't want to be alone with one. And then once in a talk where people were asking me about it, I said I've long since overcome the distrust of the opposite sex, but I still have a fear of knives and cutting.
Well, you still have time to work on that. But
another thing it said in my reading was that I had been in Atlantis, in that great continent of Pisidia that was disappeared under the sea 10,000 years ago. And then a side remark. He said the entity will be here, you see, when the earth changes again, not physically.
Not physically.
So I don't know, that meant, I guess, not in this physical body, maybe, you know.
Gladys, tell us about a physical reading. Now, you had physical readings.
A lot of them.
Could you give us an example of a physical reading?
Yes, the first, I believe I had the life reading first, and then the physical. I was having trouble with headaches, and I was wearing glasses. I had glasses for about 2 years, and the doctor prescribed these glasses for the eye strain. I had been working under a skylight, you know, and they had an awning, a colored awning with, and I'd sit there at my desk and doing like this all over my desk, you know, the shadow of it, and didn't think anything about it, just did it. And I guess that's what caused this. I mean, my eyes were hurting, and I had trouble with them. So he said to wear these glasses, you know, just all the time. So I was having headaches up there in Dayton, and so Mr. Cayce offered to give me a reading, and so right off he said that take off the glasses, you know, you don't need them, and that it was caused from poor circulation and from poor, he said, mostly from poor posture. Sit up straight, you know, leaning over my work. And I've tried to pay attention to that through the years since. And there was an intimation that I might someday have to have glasses, but it wasn't anytime soon anyway. And so and it gave me the head neck exercise, and using the violet ray around my neck and down this, you know, the shoulder, between the shoulders and so on, and which I did. And my eyes, I mean, the headache stopped immediately when I took the glasses off. And through the years, I had a lot of physical readings, but that was remarkable. And I didn't have to wear glasses until I was, I guess I was in the late 40s, really, when I had to, because I was farsighted, which the reading mentioned, and mentioned the left eye being weaker than the right. And Lyndon Stroyer was having trouble with his eyes, and he had a reading about the same time, and it pointed out that I had far stigmatism, and he had, what's the other one now? Near, you know, he was nearsighted while I was farsighted, physically.
Gladys, what is the most impressive physical reading that you remember? Now, that's kind of a tough question of all the thousands you recorded, but does one particular reading come to mind that was especially impressive?
One physical reading, I remember going to the dentist, and he said that he'd never seen anybody with worse tonsils than I had. It was just awful, you know. You need to get taken out, and sooner the better, and so forth. And so I had a reading for that, and the reading said that the tonsils were there for a purpose, and they, should not be taken out. And he said it might someday be necessary, but not now. And they were there, they were needed in the body, like a, like a wastebasket. I mean, the poisons went through the tonsils, to be eliminated. And so it wasn't until after we moved to Virginia Beach, I mean, just about 2 or 3 years before Mr. Cayce died, I was in the late 30s. I was having trouble, and he said that time to take out the tonsils now. They'd done their job, take them out. So I went to Dr. Walter Taylor, who took them out right in his office, with a local anesthetic. Never had any problem at all.
Gladys, Edgar Cayce was taunted some during his lifetime. He had bad press occasionally. He was arrested in New York and again in Detroit.
Right.
Could you tell us about some of those days? He was accused of practicing medicine without a license, I believe.
And that was in Detroit.
In Detroit. What do you remember about those days? They must have been very discouraging and traumatic.
They were. Especially, I've just gotten through copying some of this information on the Detroit case, and I think that was harder on him than the New York one, because in New York, the people gathered around us. We had so many friends and members up there, and they gathered around, and we stayed in the hotel there for an extra week or 2 weeks or something for the trial to come, and we had all these friends and
So he was brought to trial in New York.
In New York, and in Detroit, we had good friends too. I mean, if we hadn't, we would have been in jail, I guess. Stayed in jail. We'd only there about an hour, I guess. But
you said we. Did you go to jail also? The whole
yes,
group?
yes. Mr. and Mrs. Cayce and I, in New York, were all three arrested, and but we didn't get in jail. We didn't get put on the mat as empty, whatever. Anyway, we got out on bail or something, and before we got in jail. And Hugh Lynn was back in Virginia Beach when that happened. Atlanta University was still going, and he was a librarian there, and they, it was still hanging on. This was in 1931, November 1931. And in Detroit, it was just we had the Dillmans and the Wachowskis and the Weingardens, 3 families there that just got us out immediately. We were, and but we had to. They let us come home. Though we came home and waited till about March to have the trial.
What was the charge in
Detroit? In Detroit, it was practicing medicine without a license.
And in New York, it was a different
fortune telling.
Which was against the law in New York.
Yeah. And we had the police women came in the hotel and stayed for about a week, I guess, and kept bothering Mr. Cayce trying to get an appointment, And we were getting ready to leave that late that afternoon. We were coming back to Virginia Beach, and he decided he would give them the reading, and so they just immediately, when the reading was over, they had the police waiting outside, and they came in and arrested us.
Now, did he consider at that time stopping, giving the readings? Or
No,
was this
no, he didn't. He didn't consider stopping because I mean people rallied around and assured him, you know, that he, you know, he shouldn't stop. And he was vindicated too in the New York. You know, they didn't fine him or anything, but in Detroit they did. In Detroit, it was in the reading. We had a reading on it, and it said that he was technically guilty of doing that, which is against the law. Although the man accused him of doing treatments, well, he didn't do any treatment. You see, he just recommended what to do. But anyway, they were very helpful. I mean, all of the people involved. We had good lawyers, and we have a whole on both of those instances. We have the whole record.
So he was vindicated in each case and went on with his
Yes,
with
and
his
it was on the trip back from that in March. It was March 3rd, I believe, that Hugh Lynn went with Mr. Cayce back to Detroit for the trial. And see, this happened in November. Both of them happened in the New York and the Detroit. Both happened in November. Isn't that interesting? I hadn't thought of that before. Mm-hmm. And so we were allowed to come home, and then Mr. Cayce had to go back for the trial. They just held one of us, you see, with him, and so they let him come home and delayed the trial until March, and Hugh Lynn went with him, and we didn't have a transcript of that whole procedure until 1972. One of our members went and got a copy of the whole thing and sent it to Hugh Lynn, and
so we have the transcript of that trial?
Yeah, both of them, the New York and it's in with that reading, which I just finished doing. We read that reading last Tuesday, but behind that in the library, and I've just made it available for the people who have a book, is that whole thing, you know, with these people reporting, you know, like Charlie Dillman, Mr. Wachowski, and Mr. Weingarten, who had all had readings, and you know, they gave the answer to the questions they've asked.
Gladys, in 1942, There Is a River was published, and Tom Shigrew had actually lived with the family, hadn't he?
Yes, for 2 years.
For 2 years.
And he'd been there off and on, I mean, since let's see, he was in school, 1930, 27, I think, 1927, when he came home from Washington Lee with Hugh Lynn.
Yeah, now he was a classmate of Hugh Lynn's at Washington Lee, and lived with the family a while, and then wrote There Is a River.
Yes.
Which is still, many people feel, the best biography
I think it is.
of Cayce by far.
Yes.
What was the impact of the publication of There Is a River? What effect did it have on the work?
It was a good impact. There Is a River, and I think maybe if that article, Miracle Man of Virginia Beach, hadn't come out in the Coronet magazine in September of 1943, I mean, things might have been different. But because There Is a River brought a lot of people into the work, but it brought them with an understanding of what it was all about, you know, while this Coronet article was pointing up, I mean, just the miracle after miracle, you know, and all you had to do was to call up Virginia Beach and get an appointment, you know, and talk to his secretary and get an appointment and so on. And it was just deluged.
So it raised expectations dramatically around the country.
Right. And it just, Mr. Cayce just couldn't cope with it. I mean, he had appointments 2 years in advance when he died. And people had sent in their membership, and we had finally stopped when he got ill in late August, and he couldn't, went away to rest, and we just stopped making appointments. At that late date, we stopped making them.
And after he died, I understand that you had to actually
We had to return that money.
The
I
fees
think there
to
was
all those
about
people.
$13,000
Uh-huh.
in the bank from these, and
Advance payment on
yes,
these
yes,
readings.
yes,
Uh-huh.
and they had appointments 2 years in advance, and
Now, in order to try to serve these people, who were many of them waiting and some were desperate, he began to give more readings.
He doubled up on the readings. He wouldn't give readings. He still stuck to the 2 readings a day most of the time. Sometimes he'd do a third one. But he would double up and get, instead of getting 1 reading, devoting the whole time to one person, he'd get 5 or 6 or more. I think one time we had 7 or 8 or something like that. It was just awful.
And the readings began to get a little shorter at that period.
Yes,
didn't they?
yes.
He
It was sort of brief everything instead of going into great detail. And yet some of those readings were just as helpful as some of the long ones were. Some of the, I mean, we still have members that came in at that late date and got help.
Now, he was told in a reading, I understand, that he should not double up.
Yes.
That
yes.
he should not give more than
yes.
the 2.
Yes. Well, he had been, when he was so busy, he would fill up Sundays, you know, and so Mrs. Cayce and I just reneged. We just made him stop doing it on Sunday, and he stopped that. But I remember her pleading with him, and he says, well, I've got to, he would pour over this correspondence. Hugh Lynn was overseas, you know, Ed Gavin's overseas. If Hugh Lynn had been home, I think he could have handled it, because Mr. Cayce would trust him and let him talk to these people and you know, and answer them and make the appointments and all that. But he was trying to do it all himself, and there's bags of mail just coming in, and he'd sit and pore over these letters, telling, and he felt sorry for the people, you know, they would complain about the awful condition they were in, and this, that, and the other. And she said, she just begged him, she says, you've just got to stop this. And he says, oh, I can't, I've got to help these people, they, you know, just got to. And she says, well, Edgar, if you keep on like you're going, pretty soon you won't be able to help anybody. And he said, I know it, but I'll just keep on as long as I can, and then I'll be through. And that's what he did.
Did Edgar Cayce follow the general health principles of the readings? Did he take care of his health?
He didn't. He would follow the readings for himself a while, but he wasn't consistent in it. You know, he would. And toward the end there, the last. I think one of the things that he was told to get osteopathic treatments. He had a stricture in the side, in the intestines from an appendix operation, which was where the intestines were all twisted around the appendix or something, and they had to operate, and there was, you know, he had trouble all his life with that afterwards, and he would get readings and follow them and be helped by them, but he wasn't consistent about using. And the final check reading he had, not the final one, but like along in the late summer of 1944, he was told to have, I think, 3 osteopathic treatments a week and do these packs and a lot of things he was to do. Well, it was the war years, and we didn't have gas, you know, to go and come. And besides, if he had gone into Norfolk, we had no osteopath in Virginia Beach. If he'd gone into Norfolk 3 times a week, it would take up at least a half a day, you know, to go and come, even if we could get gas. And and he just couldn't do that. I mean, if he wouldn't be able to give the readings, you see. So he decided he'd try to keep up with the readings.
How long before his death did he stop giving readings?
In late August, I think he probably wouldn't have stopped then, except he realized that he, I think, had a slight stroke, because he had been pecking out letters on his little portable typewriter that Ed Givens bought for him when he went to work, and he would answer all of his personal letters on that, but the other letters he would dictate. And he got so he couldn't use his hand. One hand was, he couldn't use it to type.
He was 67 at that
67.
67 at that point.
Yeah. And so he realized that, and everybody pleading with him to go and rest. And Dr. Henry George he was an osteopath from Wilmington, Delaware. He had come to the Congress that year, and he told him he just had to rest and he had to get away. And so they asked in a reading where to go, and the reading suggested Roanoke. And Mr. Cayce had been up there and liked it, and so they went to Roanoke and drove to Roanoke and stayed in a hotel there. And then he got into the hands of a doctor there who, we all felt just went off a tangent. Instead of following the readings on him, why he had his own system of treating him, and we didn't know that he was not following the reading. We thought he was.
Gladys, what were the circumstances of Edgar Cayce's death? That is, was he able to say some final things to people who were close to him?
Well, I didn't tell you about in February of 1944, he went to Florida to visit Tom Shigrew, and that was supposed to be a vacation, and it was. He enjoyed it, but he took cold. He had something like the flu, I guess, and a pneumonia, and his heart was enlarged. I mean, the reading even mentioned that, and Dr. Woodhouse, who was an old-time physician, a wonderful man, and a good friend of Mr. Cayce, he would come and see him, and he said, he was telling Mr. Cayce about this new drug that called, what was that? Somebody, for goodness sakes, what is that drug?
Some antibiotic of
Yes,
some kind.
yes. What is that first thing that came out like that they gave to everybody? Sulfa drug. And he said that it seemed to work with some people, and so Mr. Cayce decided to try it, and Dr. Woodhouse admitted later that it wasn't good. I mean, it was harmful rather than helpful, in his condition. And he had, and Dr. Henry George, who came down to see him, he came to see him in Roanoke and then also in Virginia Beach after he came back in November. And he had us he said if he won't come to the hospital, he tried to get him to come to Wilmington where he could keep him in the hospital and, have all the treatments and everything. But he didn't want to go. And so he said to me, if we can't take him to the hospital, we'll have to bring a hospital to him. So we got a hospital bed and everything that and then Dr. George and Dr. Woodhouse called in Dr. Taylor, Dr. Waller Taylor, who was Sally Cayce's brother. And so the three of them, they put their heads together, and of course they did everything they could. But
how did he feel about the work toward the end of his life? Did he feel that the readings had given adequate guidance for the continuation of it? Did he have any particular aspirations for his future?
I don't think he worried about that too much. I remember one time him saying to Hugh Lynn, that Hugh Lynn was always anxious to get on with the research, you know, and we were trying to index the readings, not knowing how, and we were putting them on cards with a little sentence out of a reading, you know, something like that, and trying to index under. It wasn't until later that we had the people show us how to do it. When Remington Rand came and showed us. But anyway, Mr. Cayce was irritated about that. He says, well, you can do that after I'm gone, he said. Do that after he didn't, he just put his mind away from that. That was not his problem.
Gladys, what was Edgar Cayce's greatest contribution to the world? I know he's had a tremendous impact on your life and on all of our lives. What is your first thought in terms of his impact? What is his greatest contribution?
Well, I can think, I've said, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest thing he gave to me, I think, was the realization that we are responsible for our own destiny, you might say. I mean, we are all, and the close relationship that I have with God, or the understanding I have of Jesus, and he just made the Bible come alive for me through personally and also through the readings. Just an understanding of life that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I think he's done the same thing for a lot of people.
Sure. That's a marvelous statement to close with as our tape comes to an end. And all of us who know you recognize that you have in abundance all of those characteristics which we attribute to mature souls, and gentleness and long-suffering and patience, particularly long-suffering.
Oh, let me tell you, one of the first sentences in my life reading, it says, a goodly soul and rather old, you see.
That's right. And then finally, that unending capacity to love. So thank you, Gladys, and will you join me in expressing our appreciation? You're marvelous.